They say every family has a final moment, a point where the last thread snaps, not with a loud explosion, but with the quiet certainty that something has changed forever. But what happens when that moment doesn't happen behind closed doors, in the privacy of a living room or a kitchen or a hallway where tension hangs like humidity? What happens when the breaking point belongs to a family whose every breath is documented, analyzed, magnified, and weaponized by the entire world? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Tonight, the world is not watching a royal disagreement. It is watching a collapse. Because for the first time, the future king isn't staying silent. He isn't stepping back. He isn't swallowing the pain for the sake of duty, stability, or that famous royal phrase, keep calm and carry on. Instead, something unprecedented has happened. Something that even palace insiders didn't believe would come this soon, or come at all. A line has been crossed, and the man who crossed it is not a politician, an enemy state, or a foreign power. It is William's own brother. So the real question becomes this: when a future king finally turns, what does that look like? Does he raise his voice? Does he issue a quiet warning? Or does he deliver a sentence so final that it erases not just the argument, but the relationship itself? Tonight, the sentence echoes across the world, through headlines, whispers, and stunned silence. You're dead for us. Not physically, not literally, but emotionally, symbolically, permanently. A declaration that doesn't just close a chapter, it slams the book shut. And the world can't look away. Because this isn't just another royal headline, not another rift, not another disagreement between two men who grew up side by side. This moment is different. The tension is different. The silence surrounding it feels different. The consequences will be different. So what changed? Why now? Why this moment, and not the dozens before it? Something happened behind palace walls. Something shifted. Something was said, received, and finally believed. And once it happened, the response was no longer diplomatic, gentle, or restrained. It was final. You're dead for us. A sentence that signals the end of brotherhood, end of patience, and end of hope, at least from one side. But here's the real twist. No one expected William to get here first. Because the world always assumed that if anyone would walk away, it would be Harry. He was the one who left the institution, the country, the royal role. He was the one who spoke publicly, repeatedly, emotionally. He was the one who kept pushing forward with accusations, interviews, memoirs, and Netflix specials. And yet, through all of it, William remained the constant. The calm one, the silent one, the steady heir. So when the silent one finally speaks, it matters. The world is suddenly paying attention in a different way, not with curiosity, but with disbelief. Because this isn't a man who reacts impulsively. This isn't a man who lashes out without calculation. William is measured. William is careful. William is trained for restraint in a way most people can't even imagine. So what does it mean when the most controlled man in the monarchy reaches his limit? What did Harry say or do that made the future king stop turning the other cheek? That's what makes this moment explosive, because it tells us something no insider has ever said out loud. If William is done, then the royal family is done. Think about that for a moment. For years, the narrative has been built around two ideas. Harry walked away. William wanted him back. But what if that second part was never true? What if the truth is far more complicated and far more devastating? Picture this. The man preparing for the throne isn't just closing a door. He is locking it. He is sealing it. He is sending a message not just to Harry, but to the entire world. Enough. And the timing isn't accidental. Something has escalated. Something has pushed past the point of no return. Not in the past, not historically, not in childhood memories, but right now. This moment matters because it signals a shift inside the monarchy. For years, the palace strategy was simple. Silence is strength. Silence is dignity. Silence protects stability. But now the silence is gone. Not through an official announcement. Not through a press release. Not through a palace spokesperson. Through a reaction. And reactions are rarely controlled. So ask yourself, what did Harry expect would happen after years of public attacks? After interviews, accusations, and explosive storytelling? Did he expect an apology? A negotiation? A conversation? Or did he believe that as long as he kept speaking, the royal family would be forced to absorb it, forever restrained by their own traditions? Because here is where the irony cuts deep. Harry's freedom was supposed to liberate him. Instead, it isolated him. And William's silence, once seen as weakness, has now become power. Because people are finally asking the question no one dared to ask before. What if William isn't the brother trying to save the relationship? What if he's the brother ending it? That possibility changes everything, especially now, when the monarchy is entering a new era under intense scrutiny, pressure, and transition. A divided family isn't just painful. It's dangerous. It affects public opinion, national stability, and the very institution Harry claims to critique. So the moment William reportedly said those words, the meaning was bigger than anger. It was strategy. It was a message. It was the turning point. And here's where things become even more unsettling. Insiders aren't denying it. No one is rushing to say the story is wrong. No one is stepping forward to soften it. Instead, something even louder is happening. Silence. And silence, in the royal world, is confirmation. Because if it wasn't true, the palace would push back, quietly, strategically, swiftly. But they haven't. So now the world waits. Not for an apology, not for reconciliation, but for impact. Because the moment a future king emotionally cuts out his own brother, the consequences don't stay inside the palace. They ripple across the monarchy, across the media, across the public, across the legacy that both brothers were born into, but only one stayed to carry. So where does that leave Harry? Outside the institution he thought he no longer needed, but suddenly, unmistakably, cannot return to. Not because he left, but because he was shut out. And if that is true, then this is not a story about escape. It's a story about exile. But exile comes in two forms, voluntary and enforced. For years, the world believed Harry's exile was the first kind, chosen, intentional, self-directed. Now, the narrative flips. If William is truly done, then Harry's exile becomes permanent, not by choice, but by consequence. That is why this moment matters now. Not last month, not last year, not during the interviews, the book release, the documentaries, or the dramatic headlines. Now, because this is the first time the royal family's response isn't passive. It's decisive, it's emotional, it's final, and maybe the most devastating detail of all is this. William didn't just speak as a prince. He spoke as a brother who has reached the end of something that once felt unbreakable. So the audience watching this isn't just witnessing royal history. They're witnessing human tragedy. A family that once stood as a global symbol of unity, duty, and resilience is now splintering in real time, and no one knows how far the fracture will spread. But here's the question no one is prepared to answer. If the future king can emotionally sever ties with his own brother, what else? Or who else can be cut out next? Because this isn't just about one relationship. It's about a shift in power, a shift in patience, a shift in the monarchy's internal rules. The old strategy was survival. The new strategy might be self-preservation. And that means every decision going forward will be colder, faster, and more permanent. So now, the world waits for one moment, the next move. Not from Harry, from William. Because once a line is crossed, there are only two outcomes. Someone steps back, or someone steps further. And if William steps further, the consequences won't be quiet. They will be historic. The kind that changes the royal family not for a week or a headline cycle, but for a generation. Which leads us to the moment everything pivots. The event that forced William to finally speak, to finally react, and to finally declare that the brother he once defended is no longer part of the future he must protect. But what triggered it? What happened behind closed doors? What was said that couldn't be forgiven? And why did this moment break the silence when so many others failed to? The answer is coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every story has a moment where the air changes. Not visibly, not dramatically, not with shouting, broken glass, or slammed doors. Sometimes, the most dangerous shift happens quietly, in the space between what someone expected and what they finally realized would never happen. And for the royal family, that moment didn't arrive during a global interview, a book launch, or a documentary premiere. It arrived in the stillness afterward, when the noise had faded and the consequences finally settled into something undeniable. The breaking point wasn't a headline. It was a realization. The kind that doesn't just sting, it alters the future. So ask yourself this. How many chances does one brother give another before patience turns into something else entirely? Before the disappointment becomes exhaustion? Before exhaustion becomes acceptance? And before acceptance becomes a cold, decisive line that can't be erased? Because in this story, the breaking point wasn't sudden. It was accumulated, layered, built over time until one final moment tipped the balance from restraint to resolve. A moment Palace insiders now describe with the kind of quiet seriousness that tells you everything without saying anything at all. Something changed, but not in the way anyone expected. For years, the world watched the tension between William and Harry like spectators at a slow-moving train collision, horrified, fascinated, unable to look away. Each new interview, each new accusation, each new revelation added weight to a story that felt both familiar and increasingly unpredictable. And through it all, William remained silent, controlled, unshaken. People called it dignity. Others called it strategy. Some believed it was denial. But they were all wrong. Because silence is not always the absence of emotion. Sometimes, silence is the storing of it. And every time Harry spoke publicly, whether directly or indirectly, whether through implication or accusation, the silence wasn't empty. It was filling, quietly, heavily, completely, until there was no room left. That's what makes the breaking point so unexpected. People assumed it would come in response to something dramatic, a shocking claim, a new interview, a major betrayal. But instead, it happened at a moment so ordinary that no one noticed it at first. Not the media, not the public, not even members of the extended royal circle who believed they had seen every possible phase of this family fracture. The world missed it, because the world was looking in the wrong place. They were watching the noise. The breaking point was in the silence that followed it. Picture this: a palace room not filled with shouting, but with stillness. A conversation not fueled by rage, but by clarity. No dramatic outburst. No theatrics. Just a sentence delivered with the kind of calm that comes only when someone has stopped fighting, not because they've lost, but because the fight no longer matters. It was the moment when William understood something irreversible. Harry wasn't coming back. Not emotionally. Not physically. Not to the family. Not to the institution. Not to the relationship they once believed time alone could repair. And once that truth landed, everything else followed. Because reconciliation requires two people, and William realized he was the only one still trying. That realization didn't create anger. It created finality. So if you're expecting this chapter to be explosive, chaotic, or dramatic in the loud sense, you may be surprised to learn that the most powerful endings don't happen with raised voices. They happen when the need to speak disappears altogether. Still, the world keeps asking the same question. Why now? Why this moment? Why did William reach his limit after years of staying silent? Was it the last interview? The last public comment? The latest subtle accusation that wasn't subtle at all? Maybe, but insiders suggest something far more personal. It wasn't the words Harry said publicly, at least, not directly. It was the realization that Harry was no longer speaking as a brother, but as a narrator. Someone who wasn't just sharing experiences, but framing them, rewriting them, retelling them in ways that turned private history into public storytelling. And William finally understood that as long as Harry had an audience, the story would never end. Imagine carrying the weight of responsibility for an institution where every reaction becomes a headline, every emotion becomes analysis, and every silence becomes speculation. Now imagine doing that while also watching your own brother turn the most painful moments of your shared life into content. How long can someone carry both? The crown and the wound. That is where the breaking point truly formed. Not from anger, but from impossibility. William was being asked to do two things at once: protect the monarchy and protect the relationship. And eventually, he realized those goals were no longer aligned. The moment they split, the decision became unavoidable. But here's what most people misunderstand. The breaking point didn't happen because William stopped caring. It happened because he finally accepted that caring wouldn't change anything. Sometimes, the most heartbreaking decisions aren't made in fury. They're made in acceptance. That's why this moment feels different, because William didn't react impulsively. He responded internally, quietly, permanently. And once the shift happened, Everything else followed like falling dominoes. The advisors noticed it first, not through what William said, but through what he stopped saying. Meetings became shorter. Discussions were more focused. There was no emotional circling, no lingering hesitation, no searching for solutions that no longer existed. The hope that once shaped every internal conversation was gone, replaced by something colder. Not hatred, not revenge, not punishment. Distance. A distance that wasn't temporary. A distance that would redefine the future. Insiders describe it with phrases like a turning point, a new phase, and the most telling of all, a conclusion. That's not the language of conflict. That's the language of finality. And in the royal world, finality is rare, especially when it involves blood. But the bloodline no longer protects the bond. Not after this. Of course, the public didn't see the change immediately. They continued watching the visible storyline, the interviews, the appearances, the shifting public perception. But underneath, something deeper was unfolding. A quiet restructuring of emotional reality. Because here's the hidden truth. Breakups don't always announce themselves. Sometimes, the relationship has ended long before anyone admits it. And that was the case here. For William, the breaking point wasn't the moment he snapped. It was the moment he didn't. The moment he stopped going through the emotional routine of patience, disappointment, reevaluation, hope, repeat. That pattern had been happening for years, long before the public ever noticed cracks forming. But now, the cycle was over. Not paused, not delayed, over. And with the end of that cycle came a clarity that was both liberating and devastating. Because accepting that something is permanent doesn't erase the pain. It simply changes its shape. And William, for the first time, wasn't carrying the pain as someone waiting for things to get better. He was carrying it as someone who knew they wouldn't. So the breaking point didn't feel like collapse. It felt like conclusion. But here's the twist. Conclusions don't stay quiet forever. They eventually surface. Not through emotional outbursts, but through decisions. Actions. Shifts in behavior noticeable enough that even the outside world begins to sense something has changed. And soon, people did. Reporters began noting a difference in tone. Photographers captured a different expression. Commentators picked up on sharper boundaries. Insiders started choosing their words more carefully. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. The air was no longer waiting. Something was coming. Not from Harry, but from William. And that's what makes this breaking point so compelling. The world is used to Harry being the one driving the story, initiating movement, generating reaction. But now, for the first time, the center of gravity has shifted. The quiet brother has become the decisive one. And when the person who holds the future of the monarchy changes position, the entire monarchy changes with him. So if the breaking point felt invisible at the time, it won't stay invisible for long. Because this moment is the beginning of what comes next. Not reconciliation, not negotiation, not temporary distance disguised as reflection. A new reality. And once you enter a new reality, there is no returning to the old one, no matter how much history, blood, or shared memory exists. Which leads to the question no one is ready to answer. If this was only the breaking point, what happens when the consequences begin? Because the moment William accepted the finality of the divide, something else happened, something that would escalate everything far beyond silence. The reaction. And the reaction wasn't his alone. Someone else would feel the shift. Someone who was never supposed to be pulled into the center of the storm. Someone who would respond in a way that turned a quiet conclusion into a global shockwave. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every rivalry has a beginning. But the most devastating ones don't start with hatred. They start with love, with closeness, with two people who were never supposed to drift apart in the first place. That's why the world can't look away from the story of William and Harry. Because this isn't a feud between distant relatives or political opponents. This is a fracture between two boys who once stood side by side, not out of duty, but out of survival. Two brothers who became each other's shield long before they became symbols. So how does a bond like that turn into something cold enough that one of them finally says, "You're dead for US?" Not suddenly, not explosively, but slowly, one shift at a time. You don't notice the distance when it begins. At first, it looks like growing up. Different lives, different paths, different responsibilities. But then, somewhere along the way, it stops being difference and becomes division. And that's what makes this chapter so unnerving. Because the world thought the war started when Harry walked away from the royal family. But insiders say the truth is far more complicated. The separation didn't begin when Harry left. It began when the brothers were still standing side by side. For most families, that's normal. For this family, it was dangerous. Because the monarchy survives on unity. Not emotional unity, public unity. The appearance of alignment. The visual of stability. Once that disappears, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. And that's exactly what happened. Slowly, quietly, until the distance became visible. The public saw the first signs long before they understood them. Subtle changes during appearances, body language experts suddenly becoming celebrities, commentators turning small gestures into global theories. Some insisted it was exaggerated. Others sensed something real. But both groups were missing the most important truth. By the time the world noticed the cracks, the brothers had already stopped standing in the same place internally. Here's the irony. For years, William believed the distance was temporary. Harry believed it was inevitable. Two different expectations. Two different realities. One inevitable collision. Because when one person is trying to hold on and the other is trying to break free, the end isn't a question. It's a countdown. And that countdown accelerated the moment Harry no longer wanted to be defined by the institution, while William no longer had the choice. That's the core of the divide. Not anger. Not betrayal. Not argument. Identity. One brother trying to escape his role. One brother preparing to embody his. How can two paths that opposite ever meet again? The world keeps asking who changed. But the real question is, who stayed the same? Because in every fractured relationship, there comes a moment when someone outgrows the dynamic, and the other person still needs it. Harry outgrew the institution. William still needed it. Not for himself, but for the country he will one day lead. And that's where the emotional complexity becomes impossible to ignore. Because Harry didn't just walk away from a job. He walked away from a future William couldn't follow him out of. For Harry, leaving was liberation. For William, it was abandonment. Not just of the family, but of the responsibility they were supposed to carry together. Suddenly, the brother who once stood beside him was no longer a partner. He was a critic, a narrator, a voice on the outside looking in and speaking out. And that changed everything. Because criticism from a stranger is noise. Criticism from a brother is damage, especially when the world is listening. But here is where the shift becomes irreversible. Harry didn't just criticize the institution. He personalized it. He told stories that involved William. He shared moments that were once private. He revealed conversations that were once sacred. And William realized something devastating. As long as Harry saw their shared past as material, the relationship would never be safe again. Imagine discovering that the person who knows your most vulnerable moments now has the freedom and the global platform to share them whenever he chooses. How do you repair trust after that? Trust isn't just about forgiveness. It's about safety. And William no longer felt safe in the relationship. That is the moment everything changed. Not because of what was said, but because of what could be said next. Uncertainty can destroy a bond far faster than conflict. The fear of the next reveal. The fear of the next interview. The fear of the next accusation framed as revelation. That's how distance becomes defensive, not emotional distance. Strategic distance. William wasn't stepping away out of anger. He was stepping away out of protection, not for himself, but for the institution he is obligated to defend. Because here is the brutal truth most people don't want to acknowledge. William doesn't belong to himself. He belongs to the crown. Everything he does and doesn't do affects millions, not just one family. Harry walked away from that reality. William will one day become it. So while Harry gained freedom, William gained pressure. And pressure changes people in different ways. Harry became expressive. William became silent. Harry told stories. William protected them. Harry spoke in first person. William lived as a symbol. Those two identities cannot coexist peacefully forever. At some point, they will tear. Not because someone wants the destruction, but because the two paths are no longer moving in the same direction. And once the tear becomes visible, every new action accelerates it. A wedding, a move, an interview, a comment, a memoir. One event doesn't break a bond, but each one pulls the thread, until finally, One last pull doesn't just loosen the fabric, it separates it completely. Insiders say that separation became undeniable when William realized the story was no longer between two brothers. It was between a brother and the world. And once the world becomes the audience, the relationship is no longer private. It becomes performance. No bond survives that transformation unchanged. So when people ask why William finally reached the point of no return, the answer is both simple and heartbreaking. He didn't lose his brother. He lost the version of his brother who existed before the world became involved. And once that version was gone, the relationship that depended on it disappeared too. But if that's the emotional truth underneath the conflict, then the next part of the story becomes even more shocking. Because just when the distance seemed complete, something happened that no one expected. Harry spoke again, publicly, directly, and this time, what he said didn't just widen the divide. It detonated it. Because the public never heard what Harry said next, until now. Sometimes it only takes one sentence. Not a paragraph. Not a speech. Not a dramatic confession. Just a single line that hits differently than all the ones that came before it. That's how this part of the story begins. Not with a scandal exploding out of nowhere, but with a moment the world almost missed. A moment that didn't seem catastrophic at first glance. A moment most people brushed off as just another comment in a long line of interviews, opinions, and emotional retellings. Until it wasn't. Because this time, something changed. Not in the public. Not in the headlines. Not even immediately inside the palace. It changed in William. And that was enough to change everything else. But before we get there, ask yourself something. How many times can someone hear their name spoken publicly, framed through someone else's perspective, before the meaning itself begins to shift? Before memory stops being shared truth and becomes contested territory? Because that's what this interview did. It didn't introduce new information. It reintroduced old wounds. And sometimes, reopening a scar is more dangerous than creating a new one. The interview wasn't promoted as explosive. It wasn't advertised as the kind of broadcast that would shake institutions or send shockwaves across the world. It appeared like all the others. Another conversation, another platform, another moment where Harry spoke about his life, his experiences, and the journey he says he's still trying to understand. But there was one crucial difference. This time, the tone changed. There was no sadness, no confusion, no hesitation. There was certainty. And certainty is powerful, especially when it comes from someone who once lived inside a world they are now describing from the outside. Viewers noticed it instantly. This wasn't reflective Harry. This was definitive Harry. And definitive Harry is the version William feared most. Because once someone becomes certain, they stop leaving room for reconciliation. Uncertainty keeps doors open. Certainty locks them shut. So what did Harry say in that interview? Not something that sounded explosive to the outside world. Just a sentence that crossed a line only the inside world understood. A sentence that reframed William, not as a brother who disagreed, but as a figure responsible for something Harry implied was deeper, darker, and more damaging than anyone had previously understood. The public heard it as criticism. William heard it as betrayal. Not because of the content, but because of the shift. This time, Harry wasn't speaking about the institution. He was speaking about the air. And that changed everything. Because criticizing the monarchy is one thing. Targeting the future king is another. Even unintentionally, the impact is the same. And Harry knew that. So did William. Here's what insiders say made the interview different. Harry didn't just share his feelings. He assigned meaning to William's silence. Meaning that made William responsible not only for what happened in the past, but for what Harry believes is still happening now. That's the moment the fuse was lit. Because when someone stops being described as part of the story and instead becomes portrayed as the cause of the story, the dynamic shifts from emotional conflict to moral indictment. And that cannot coexist with the crown. Not now. Not ever. Still, the world didn't see the explosion immediately. The interview aired. Social media reacted. Commentators analyzed every facial expression, every pause, every carefully worded sentence. But most people treated it like they treated the others, as another chapter in a narrative that seemed ongoing and endless. Meanwhile, behind palace walls, the atmosphere changed. Suddenly, sharply, quietly. Staff who were used to measured responses noticed the difference first. Not because William shouted, not because he reacted dramatically, but because he didn't brush it aside this time. He absorbed it, and that was more dangerous than any visible anger. Because anger passes, absorption stays. For years, William's strategy had been consistency: stay silent, stay steady, stay above it. But this time, the silence felt different. This wasn't dignity. It was withdrawal, an emotional disengagement that advisors immediately recognized as the beginning of something irreversible. Not because William wanted revenge, but because he no longer wanted resolution. And once someone stops wanting resolution, the relationship enters freefall. But let's go back to the interview itself. The setting mattered. It wasn't a chaotic press moment. It wasn't an emotional breakdown. It wasn't impulsive. It was calm, controlled, almost clinical. Harry spoke softly. He spoke thoughtfully. He spoke with the careful precision of someone who had already rehearsed what he wanted the world to hear. And that precision is what made William stop in his tracks. Because careless words can be forgiven, calculated ones cannot. At one point, the interviewer asked a question that seemed harmless on the surface. A question about whether Harry believed certain members of his family would ever take responsibility for their role in the past. Harry didn't hesitate. He didn't soften. He didn't generalize. He didn't redirect. He answered directly. And in that answer, he didn't mention the institution. He mentioned William, not by name, but by position. The heir, the older brother, the one expected to lead. The implication was unmistakable. And here's what made it devastating. Harry framed it not as disagreement, but as failure. Not as a private conflict, but as a public truth. And when someone with global visibility frames you as morally responsible for their pain, the story changes. Not for the audience, but for the person being spoken about. William didn't see the interview as a media moment. He saw it as the moment Harry stopped speaking as a wounded sibling and started speaking as a commentator. Someone who no longer viewed the relationship as something to repair, but as something to interpret. And interpretation is far more dangerous than confession, because interpretation shapes perception. Perception shapes narrative. Narrative shapes legacy. And legacy cannot be separated from the crown. So when William realized that Harry was no longer just sharing, he was defining. The emotional stakes became institutional. Not just personal. Not just family-based. Global. Because once the future king becomes framed as part of the problem, the monarchy's stability becomes part of the fallout. And William could no longer ignore that. Still, the public didn't see the internal reaction playing out. They saw the headlines, the clips, the sound bites, the social media storms. But none of that revealed the truth happening behind the scenes. After the interview aired, something unusual happened in the palace. Meetings weren't called. Statements weren't drafted. There was no rapid strategy session. There was just stillness. A stillness so unfamiliar that longtime aides felt uneasy. Because when silence replaces action, it means one thing. A decision is forming. Not reaction. Decision. But here's where the turning point becomes impossible to reverse. For years, William believed the situation could be managed. Not healed, but contained. As long as Harry spoke about the institution, the conversation remained external. Painful, yes, but survivable. This interview changed the category. Now, the criticism wasn't about the system. It was about the successor. And once the successor becomes the subject of the narrative, the institution is no longer being challenged from the outside. It's being undermined from within. That is the line the monarchy cannot allow to be crossed. Not because of pride. Because of precedent. If a future king can be publicly depicted as morally compromised by his own brother without consequence, the monarchy's authority becomes negotiable. And authority is the only thing that keeps a constitutional monarchy intact. Harry may not have intended the interview to escalate things to that level. But intention is irrelevant when impact is global. William understood that instantly. Which is why, for the first time, insiders say he experienced something he had never allowed before. Finality. Not about the interview. About the relationship. Because when someone speaks publicly in a way that makes reconciliation impossible, the only option left is boundary. Firm boundary. Permanent boundary. But here's the twist. The interview wasn't the end. It was the spark. What happened next would turn a single sentence into a full-scale crisis. Not because of what Harry said on camera, but because of what happened off camera afterward. A private message, a response, a reaction that didn't stay private. And that was when William's silence officially broke. Not publicly, not visibly, but internally in a way that royal insiders now describe as the moment everything shifted from tolerable to terminal. Because William's response wasn't just private. It was historic. There's a saying inside the royal family that has survived for generations. Nothing leaves the palace unless the palace wants it to. But that rule is no longer true. Not anymore. Because for the first time in modern royal history, silence isn't acting as protection, it's acting as pressure. And pressure, when ignored for long enough, doesn't stay contained. It leaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but through whispers, careful phrases, anonymous briefings, and subtle shifts in behavior that speak louder than any official statement ever could. Something is changing inside the palace. And this time, people aren't denying it. They're just refusing to explain it. So the world is left with fragments, hints, signals, patterns, and the sense that something behind those walls has reached a point the institution can no longer hide. The shift didn't happen with an announcement. It happened with an absence. Because after the interview that lit the fuse, the palace didn't respond the way it always used to, with quiet resilience, firm denial, or carefully calibrated neutrality. They did something different. They did nothing. And that silence was louder than any rebuttal. For years, the royal family followed a strategy as old as the monarchy itself. Never complain, never explain. It was their strongest shield. A refusal to be pulled into public conflict, especially with their own. But every strategy has a breaking point, and insiders now say that the silence following the latest interview wasn't strategy. It was shock. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that happens when people finally realize the situation is no longer salvageable. So what does a royal shock look like? Not panic, not chaos, not visible emotion. It looks like stillness. The kind that fills a room when everyone knows something has changed, but no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Advisors who had spent years managing crises suddenly found themselves facing something entirely different. Not a scandal that needed containment, but a fracture that needed no repair because the person who could fix it no longer wanted to. William didn't issue instructions. He didn't ask for talking points. He didn't request a response. He simply stopped engaging. And when the future king disengages, the institution takes its cue. Because in the palace, silence isn't the absence of direction. It is direction. But here's where the shift becomes unmistakable. The silence didn't stay internal. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, it began to take shape externally. Royal correspondents noticed a change in tone. Palace aides stopped using certain phrases. Sources who once offered soft reassurance no longer did. Instead of "the relationship is strained," the language became "the relationship is frozen." Instead of "time will heal," the message became "there is no movement." And that is when people outside the palace began to realize the truth. This wasn't a pause. It was a conclusion. But the strangest part came next. The leaks didn't begin from frustration. They began from surrender. For years, insiders described the situation as exhausting, emotional, and unpredictable, with everyone hoping that eventually, distance would create clarity and clarity would create reconciliation. But now the atmosphere has changed completely. There is no expectation of repair, only preparation for permanence. And when an institution starts preparing for permanence, the way people speak changes, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Words become cautious. Responses become shorter. Information becomes selective, not to protect a relationship, to protect the future. Because once the palace accepts that Harry will not return, in loyalty, alignment, or narrative, the institution must adapt. Not emotionally, but structurally. That adaptation has already begun. Here's the part the public didn't notice. Harry's name has slowly disappeared from briefing language. Not officially, not publicly, but systematically. Internal discussions that once included him as part of future planning no longer do. His absence isn't treated as temporary. It's treated as normal. That may sound subtle, but in the royal world, subtle changes are seismic. A door doesn't have to be slammed to be closed. Sometimes, it simply stops being opened. But the silence didn't remain passive for long. Because while the palace wasn't speaking publicly, information began trickling out in a different way. not through statements. Through insiders, not accidental leaks. Intentional signals. The first hint came when a longtime royal correspondent used a phrase that instantly drew attention. The prince has reached a point of acceptance. Acceptance. Not frustration. Not disappointment. Not anger. Acceptance. That one word told insiders everything they needed to know, because in royal language, acceptance means the emotional decision has already been made. The rest is just execution. Another quiet shift followed soon after. Reporters began noticing that William's team no longer corrected narratives that once would have been addressed. When stories implied the brothers were still communicating, the palace didn't affirm it. They didn't deny it. They let it stand in silence. And silence, in this case, wasn't neutrality. It was confirmation. Because when something is false, the palace corrects it subtly, never aggressively, but firmly enough that the message is clear. This time, they didn't, which means the truth was simple. There was nothing left to correct. Communication wasn't strained. It was non-existent. But the most startling development came when insiders began revealing emotional shifts, carefully, cautiously, and only to trusted journalists. Not dramatic details, not explosive accusations, just small observations that carried massive meaning. Phrases like, "He is detached. He no longer holds hope. He is focusing forward." The kind of statements that feel less like updates and more like eulogies. Not for a person, for a relationship. And yet, the palace still did not speak publicly. Because royal silence is not weakness. It is strategy. The difference now is the purpose behind it. Before, silence was used to de-escalate. Now, silence is being used to distance. And that distinction changes everything. But while the external world began piecing together clues, something far more intense was happening behind the scenes. A shift among advisors who once pushed for reconciliation at any cost. These were the people who believed that unity was essential. Not emotionally, politically. Because the monarchy relies on continuity, not just of power, but of perception. Families can survive private fractures. Institutions cannot survive public ones. So for years, advisors viewed the William-Harry divide as a fire that needed to be contained. Not extinguished, contained. But after the latest interview, something happened that no one expected. They stopped containing it. Not because they gave up, because they realized the situation was no longer a fire. It was ash, and you cannot put out ash. So now, instead of trying to hold the relationship together, advisors have shifted to protecting what remains, the heir, the institution, the future. That shift is not emotional. It is strategic, and strategy creates movement. Movement creates consequences. Consequences create visibility. Which brings us to the moment the outside world finally sensed that the palace was becoming less passive, not through statements, but through presence. William's public appearances changed. Slightly, subtly, but noticeably. His posture was sharper. His tone was firmer. His expression carried something unfamiliar. Not anger. Authority. Observers called it composure. Insiders called it transition. Because when a future king begins preparing not as a son or a brother, but as the next sovereign, everything about his presence shifts. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was response, not to Harry's words, but to the realization that the era of waiting was over. So now the palace faces a new reality. If silence is no longer protecting them, silence may soon break. Not through emotion, through action. Because the monarchy rarely speaks. It moves. But the most chilling part of this chapter isn't what has already happened. It's what hasn't happened yet. Because multiple insiders have hinted at the same thing, carefully, anonymously, and without elaboration. This is only the beginning. And if that is true, then the palace is no longer reacting to Harry. It is preparing for what comes next. Something planned, something deliberate, something William has not done before. But what William said behind closed doors didn't stay there. And once it surfaced, the entire world realized the silence was over. Every crisis has a moment when someone unexpected steps into the center. Not with force, not with noise, not with dramatic confrontation, but with presence. And in this story, that person is Catherine. People think they understand her role in the royal family. They see the public grace, the composed smile, the elegance that never cracks under pressure. But what most people don't realize is that Catherine is not just the future queen consort. She is the emotional equilibrium of the monarchy, the quiet stabilizer, the unseen strategist, the person who can read a room without saying a word. So when Catherine shifts, the entire institution feels it. Which raises the question, what happens when the most steady person in the family decides the situation has gone too far? That is the turning point of this chapter. Because until now, the story has centered on William's breaking point. But what the world doesn't know is that Catherine reached hers first, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in clarity. A clarity that changed everything. Contrary to public assumption, Catherine has not been a passive observer in this conflict. She has been watching it unfold from the closest possible vantage point, not as a royal, not as a figure, but as a wife witnessing the slow erosion of someone she loves. And that changes the stakes, because this is not just a story about two brothers anymore. It is a story about protection, the protection of a husband, the protection of their children, the protection of a future that cannot afford emotional instability. Catherine knows something the public often forgets. When the heir loses stability, the crown loses security, and she would not allow that to happen. So while the world interpreted her silence as neutrality, insiders say her silence was something very different. Assessment. Catherine was watching, listening, interpreting, not reacting impulsively, but waiting for the moment when intervention was no longer optional. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. It wasn't triggered by a headline. It wasn't triggered by a documentary. It wasn't triggered by a public comment. It was triggered by something far more personal. A conversation that left William silent in a way Catherine had never seen before. She knew immediately that something had shifted, not because William spoke, because he didn't. For a man who carries the emotional weight of an institution, silence can reveal far more than words ever could. Catherine recognized that this wasn't frustration anymore. It was resignation. And resignation is dangerous, because when someone stops hoping, they stop trying. So Catherine did what she has always done in critical moments. She stepped into the role no title can define. The anchor. She didn't push him to explain. She didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. She didn't offer comforting reassurances that things would get better. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She told him the truth. Not the emotional truth. The strategic truth. That the situation with Harry was no longer a relationship problem. It was a threat. Not to William personally, but to the future he is responsible for protecting. That was the moment William's internal shift turned into external certainty. Because when Catherine speaks in that tone, calm, measured, unmistakably clear, it means she is no longer analyzing the situation as a wife. She is analyzing it as the future queen. And Catherine does not involve herself unnecessarily. Every step she takes is deliberate. So the fact that she intervened at all tells you everything. But here's what people misunderstand about Catherine's influence. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is not controlling. It is steady. She doesn't tell William what to do. She helps him see what he already knows, but hasn't allowed himself to accept. And what William hadn't allowed himself to accept was this. The relationship with Harry was no longer reparable without cost. And the cost would be paid by the crown. Catherine could see what William could not. That Harry's public narrative wasn't just emotional expression, it was shaping perception. And perception, in the world of monarchy, becomes reality. A future king cannot afford to be defined by someone else's version of events, especially not when that someone has no stake in the institution anymore. So Catherine became the quiet force redirecting the situation, not away from conflict, but away from illusion. Her message was simple. You can't save someone who doesn't want to return. And you cannot protect a bond that is now being used as a weapon. That was the turning tide. Not when William reached his breaking point. When Catherine made him see that continuing to absorb the emotional damage was no longer compassion. It was vulnerability, one that the institution could not afford. And this is where the story becomes even more powerful, because Catherine did not speak from bitterness. She spoke from lived experience. Few people understand the internal pressure of marrying into the monarchy. The scrutiny, the expectations, the microscope that turns ordinary human moments into national talking points. Catherine endured all of that while learning how to stay composed without becoming invisible. So when she watched Harry repeatedly speak about private family matters in public, she wasn't just witnessing a breach of trust. She was witnessing the weaponization of something she had spent years protecting: privacy. Privacy is not luxury in the royal family. It is survival. Without it, everything collapses. Catherine is not dramatic by nature. She is deliberate. So when she finally voiced her perspective, William listened, not because she demanded it, but because she rarely intervenes unless the moment requires it. And this moment required it. According to insiders, Catherine told William one sentence that changed his thinking completely. Not harsh, not emotional, not accusatory, just precise. If he is willing to do this now, imagine what he will do later. That was the warning Harry ignored. Because Catherine wasn't talking about the past. She was talking about pattern. A pattern that would only escalate. Not once. Not occasionally. Continually. And she was right. Patterns don't reverse without accountability. They repeat. Accelerate. Intensify. William may have been willing to absorb what had already happened. But Catherine made him realize he could not absorb what was coming next. Not for the sake of the relationship. Not for the sake of peace. Not for the sake of appearance. He had children to protect. He had a future to prepare for. He had a crown to inherit. This was no longer about two brothers. It was about legacy. But here's the part the public never saw. Catherine wasn't acting out of fear. She was acting out of certainty. Certainty that the emotional cost had reached a point where continuing to hope wasn't noble. It was destructive. Because every time Harry spoke publicly, William wasn't just reacting as a brother. He was reacting as a father. Every accusation became a headline. Every headline became commentary. Every commentary became classroom discussion. And Catherine understood something that no one else seemed to ask. What happens when their children grow old enough to read everything? Not rumors. Not speculation. Their names. Their father's pain. Their uncle's accusations. Their family's fracture. Catherine's warning wasn't about protecting William from Harry. It was about protecting their children from the fallout. Because children don't care about royal duty. They care about emotional reality. And emotional reality doesn't disappear just because the palace walls are high. So Catherine stepped in not to create distance, but to prevent damage. Damage that could last longer than any public conflict. Damage that could follow their children for the rest of their lives. That was the moment William stopped viewing silence as strength. Silence no longer felt protective. It felt exposing. So he shifted. Not dramatically. Not immediately. But decisively. From internal response to internal resolve. Catherine's influence didn't end there. She made another point, the one insiders say changed the palace's entire approach. She reminded William that as the future king, he would not only inherit power, he would inherit consequences. Every unresolved fracture becomes part of the next reign. And if Harry continued shaping the narrative without resistance, the monarchy would eventually be defined by a perspective coming from outside the institution and against it. That cannot happen. Not for stability. Not for public trust. Not for continuity. So Catherine became the quiet force that redirected the future. Not through confrontation, but through clarity. She didn't push William to take action. She pushed him to stop waiting. And once waiting ends, decision begins. Insiders described the shift as subtle but unmistakable. William became firmer, more focused, less tolerant of emotional distraction. Not because he stopped caring, because he stopped believing that caring could change anything. Catherine didn't harden him. She freed him from the weight of a hope that was slowly breaking him. And that is when everything moved into the next phase. Because once the heir stops waiting for reconciliation, the palace stops preparing for it. Which means the institution is no longer managing a conflict. It is adapting to a permanent reality. But Catherine's role in this moment isn't finished yet. Because just when it seemed like the internal shift was complete, something happened that brought her back into the center, not as a voice of strategy, but as a direct participant in the fallout. A moment that forced her into a position she had spent years avoiding. A moment driven not by the past, but by something that happened next. And Catherine delivered one warning, a warning Harry ignored. But what happened after that warning would turn the quiet turning tide into something far more irreversible. Every story has one final moment where everything could still change. Not dramatically, not magically, but realistically. A moment where the future hangs by a thread. And if someone says the right thing, or apologizes at the right time, or steps back before stepping too far, the ending could be different. This chapter is that moment. The last attempt at peace. Not the public gestures the world saw. Not the polite smiles during formal appearances. Not the carefully arranged photo opportunities designed to calm speculation. This moment happened privately, quietly, and almost no one knew it happened at all. But insiders say if things were ever going to be repaired, this was the only window where reconciliation was still possible. After this, the door didn't just close. It disappeared. So how close did they come to fixing it? Closer than anyone realizes. But sometimes, being close makes the ending even more devastating, because the story wasn't doomed from the beginning. It was lost in the final steps. The attempt for peace didn't start with Harry. It started with William. That may surprise the world, because the public narrative has always painted William as the silent one, the brother who refused to engage, refused to respond, refused to negotiate emotionally. But silence and effort are not the same thing. Just because the palace didn't announce the attempts doesn't mean they didn't happen. William tried. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, not through dramatic gestures, through private ones. Because real reconciliation doesn't happen in front of cameras. It happens in moments no one sees. For months, advisors suggested cautious steps, carefully timed communication, soft outreach, intermediaries who could ease the tension without forcing direct confrontation. William agreed every time, not because he believed the relationship would fully return to what it once was, but because he believed it didn't need to. It only needed stability. The world thinks reconciliation means returning to the past. William understood it meant creating a future without war. There is a difference. Harry, on the other hand, was in a different emotional place. Not wrong, not malicious, just different. He was speaking publicly, expressing pain, processing out loud, and redefining his identity in real time. He wasn't looking backward. He was looking outward. Those two emotional directions do not naturally meet. But they almost did. Here's what insiders say happened. After one of the interviews created more tension than expected, there was concern, not for public relations, but for the private cost. Someone close to both brothers suggested that the situation needed to be paused before it escalated beyond recovery. So communication was attempted. Carefully, quietly, privately. No cameras, no publishers, no audience. Just an opportunity. William agreed instantly. Not because he was ready to forgive, but because he was still willing to try. When someone is willing, there is still possibility. And possibility is powerful. But reconciliation cannot succeed unless both people are in the same emotional stage. Harry wasn't. Insiders say the first attempt never reached completion, not because of rejection, but because of timing. Harry was in the middle of preparing for another major public appearance, one that would inevitably include questions about the royal family. He didn't want any private communication to affect what he planned to say. That alone tells you the difference in priorities. William wanted resolution before more words were spoken. Harry wanted clarity after he spoke. Two goals that could not align. Still, William agreed to wait. That was the first window. It closed quietly. The second window came later, after another period of silence where advisors believed distance might cool emotions rather than deepen them. Sometimes space rebuilds perspective. Sometimes it builds walls. This time, it did a little of both. William was ready again. Harry wasn't sure. Not about whether he wanted reconciliation, but about what reconciliation meant. Because for Harry, reconciliation required acknowledgement. For William, reconciliation required privacy. They weren't speaking different languages. They were following different definitions. And without shared definitions, peace isn't impossible. It's invisible. The third attempt was the closest. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't orchestrated. It happened because of something unexpected, a personal moment that created a brief opening neither side planned for. William was told that Harry had expressed concern about something within the family, not institutionally, but personally. That was the first time Harry had shown emotional engagement rather than emotional distance. William reacted immediately. He reached out, not through aides, not through intermediaries, directly. That decision alone reveals everything. Because when someone is done, they do not try again. William wasn't done. Not then. He still believed there was a version of the future where the relationship could exist, even if it would never look like the past. He wasn't searching for closeness. He was searching for coexistence. But here is the truth most people don't understand. Reconciliation requires timing. Emotion doesn't respond to scheduling. If two people aren't ready at the moment passes, no matter how much love, history, or shared pain exists. And that's what happened. Not because anyone wanted failure, because they weren't aligned. Harry responded, but not the way William hoped. Instead of stepping into the moment, he stepped around it. Not with rejection, with caution. He wanted conditions, clarification, reassurance.